friends, good evening. Can you pull the door closer? Yeah, give it a good click. Excellent. Tea and everything, so very good, very warm welcome everyone. Lovely to see you to this last of our talks on Genesis, the book of Genesis. Great to have you with us this evening. As ever, I want to use this evening as an opportunity to say thank you to a few people. In particular, I want to say thank you to our fabulous kitchen crew, which is Terry and Margaret. Joe as well has been here several evenings, not this week, but so to all three, to Terry and Margaret and Joe, huge thank you for helping in the kitchen, absolutely brilliant. And obviously a huge shout out to Lewis here for bringing along the camera and videoing the talks, which is enormously helpful as well. And it does mean that you have the opportunity, if you want to watch them at home, and of course other people have the opportunity to watch them wherever they may be. And last week we gave a big shout to my wonderful sister-in-law Jackie in Oregon. Do you remember that? If you were here last week, we said hello Jackie, I'm in Oregon. And I've been asked this evening for us all to say hello to my wonderful cousin, or rather Danielle's wonderful cousin, my wonderful cousin as well, Roseanne, who's in Northern California. So what we want to say after three is hello Roseanne. So 1, 2, 3.
Hello Roseanne.
Hello Roseanne. So Roseanne, if you're watching in near San Francisco, somewhere in the San Francisco region, Roseanne, lovely to have you watching us, and hope you enjoy this evening. Sorry we can't give you any tea or coffee, but hope you enjoy the talk. Share it with friends, and hope you really enjoy learning something this evening. So big thank you to everyone who's been helping. Now, a couple of other things to mention. Firstly, is that, as I mentioned last week, the scripts for these talks will be available probably by the end of April, okay? They're more or less sort of in reasonable state at the moment, but I need to do some tweaking. And so the scripts for these talks and the PowerPoint slides will be available at the end of April. If you would like a set, there's a sign-up sheet on the table at the back. And what I'd like you to do, if you do want a set of notes, is to put your name there. Contact details, I may already have them, but if you can put a phone number or an email address, that would be really helpful. Can you also say what format you want the notes in? Do you want digital or do you want printed? And then we invite you to make a donation of £3 if it's digital, £5 if it's printed, more if you want to. You can do that if you want by bank transfer into our church bank account, and I've put the bank account details on the sign-up sheet. You'll see that at the bottom it says Newington Free Church, and you've got our bank account details, and if you want to do it that way you can. Please though make sure that when you make that payment we have some way of identifying who it's from, otherwise we won't know who the note should go to, okay? So if you want to do it that way, that's fine. If you want to give me the money this evening or at a later date, that's absolutely fine if you want to do it in cash. But that's just a little bit about the notes. Averil, you had your hand up a moment ago.
Can we also say thank you to Danielle for doing these slides on the screen, please?
We can say thank you to Danielle. Yeah, shall we say thank you to Danielle? Absolutely. In fact, this evening Danielle has a free evening because we've discovered that we've got this lovely little thing here, and I can change the slides just by using this. So Danielle can sit at the back and not have to worry about changing the PowerPoint slides. So, but thank you very much for that. And the only other thing I need to mention before we dive in for this evening really is that in September we're going to be doing another set of Tuesday evening Bible talks. And this time I'm going to be doing a series of talks on the book of Psalms. Okay, book of Psalms. Now, confession time, this will be a bit of a repeat because I did these at St. Luke's 7 years ago. But I don't think there's anybody here that was at those talks, and even if you were, you've probably forgotten them. So in September, details to come out later, but in September we'll be doing a series of talks on the book of Psalms, and lots of different angles we can approach Psalms from. But I can tell you now that one of the things we're going to look at in September is how the book of Psalms really is a book. It's not just individual psalms scattered around randomly. There's a reason why they're in that order. There's a reason why the book of Psalms looks like it does, why it's got that shape, why it's got that structure. And some of the most exciting scholarship in the last 30 or so years has been about the book of Psalms as a book. So that's one of the things we're going to be looking at when we come to that in September. So that's just to whet your appetite a little bit. It's been a huge privilege for me and a blessing for me to be able to dig into Genesis over the last month or so and to prepare these talks. I've really enjoyed it. And one of the things that I've enjoyed, and one of the things I always enjoy, apart from sharing the Bible with you, which is, I hope, the thing I enjoy most of all, but the other thing I really enjoy is sharing the wonderful insights that some of our biblical scholars have made. Biblical scholars sometimes get a bad reputation in the church. They sometimes get looked down on, and people can be a bit sniffy about biblical scholars. And I can understand that, because sometimes biblical scholars say things which aren't very helpful. But actually, we are hugely indebted to the theologians and biblical scholars who really work with the text of the Bible and try to get into the subtleties of it. And for me, one of the things that I really enjoy about doing any kind of Bible teaching is being able to share some of the things that I've learned from them and kind of pass that around. So, big shout out to some of the scholars who've helped us. I hope we do appreciate God's gift of biblical scholarship. It's something to be appreciated. I'm going to open with a prayer which was actually written by a wonderful Bible scholar at the end of the 19th century and a great champion of the faith, but also a top-class scholar. His name was Brooke Foss Westcott, and he was a New Testament scholar in the University of Cambridge and a great champion for Orthodox Christianity. I'm just going to begin with a prayer by Westcott. Blessed Lord, by whose providence all holy scriptures were written and preserved for our instruction, give us grace to study them this and every day with patience and love. Strengthen our souls with the fullness of their divine teaching. Keep from us all pride and irreverence. Guide us in the deep things of thy heavenly wisdom, and of thy great mercy lead us by thy word unto everlasting life, through Jesus Christ, our Lord and Saviour. Amen. Well, we come this evening to the third of the big stories in Genesis 12 to 50. I think I said on the first night that Genesis really divides into two big parts, Genesis 1 to 11, and then you've got this big chunk, Genesis 12 to 50. But I said on the first night that Genesis 12 to 50 really divides into three big stories, or three big cycles as they're sometimes called. You've got the story of Abraham, and then the story of Jacob, a little bit about Isaac but not much, story of Abraham, story of Jacob, and this evening we come to the third of those big stories, the story of Joseph. At least that is what it is usually called, because Joseph is the main character in it. But as I said last week, even in the Joseph story, Jacob, here, his father, is still very much alive. And as we will see tonight, Jacob does play an important part in this story, as do Joseph's brothers. And in actual fact, if you've got your Bibles open, and if you look at the verse where this story starts, so it's chapter 37 verse 1, the heading for this section actually says, "This is the story of the family of Jacob." And that's not an accident. It's not just about Joseph. So although Joseph's the famous one, although he's the central character, this story that we're going to look at tonight, Genesis 37 through to 50, is not just about Joseph. It's very much the story of the family of Jacob. One person who is less prominent in this section, wait for it, is God. Now, of course, God is there behind the scenes, and ultimately everything that happens in this story is ordered and directed by God, and that is precisely the point that Joseph will highlight towards the end of the story. We're going to see that later. Towards the end, several times, Joseph highlights the fact that everything that has happened in some way has been directed by God. That's not to deny human responsibility, but ultimately Joseph is going to really bring this out at the end, that everything that happens in this story we can trace back to God. And yet there is only one occasion in the entire Joseph story, if we can call it that, there's only one occasion where we read of God actually appearing and speaking to someone. And that's in chapter 46, verses 3 and 4, where God appears to Jacob and he speaks to Jacob. But otherwise, in this entire story, there are no instances of God actually appearing and speaking to people. And if you want to do a really interesting study sometime, if you were to go through Genesis, you would find that gradually the direct appearances of God become less common. So they're much more common with Abraham, a little bit less common with Jacob. And when you come to Joseph, nowhere does God appear and speak directly to Joseph. You say, what about the dreams? But even in the dreams, God doesn't speak to Joseph and say, I am the Lord your God. God gives Joseph dreams and he reveals what will happen in dreams, but God doesn't actually speak to Joseph in dreams. So there's a sense in this last part of Genesis in which, although God is of course absolutely involved with what's happening, he is, if you like, just stepping back. He's not so obvious, if we can put it that way. He's not so obvious, he's not so upfront. And of course you get that in other parts of the Bible. When we looked at Ruth last year, we saw the same thing in the book of Ruth. God was definitely involved, but in a fairly kind of discreet, behind-the-scenes way. And that's the case with the story of Joseph. At the same time, I think we can say that with Joseph, we do see somebody who is showing a growing spiritual and moral maturity. I've got a nice comment here from Gordon Wenham. And Gordon Wenham talks about how Abraham and Jacob are both prone to some really horrendous lapses in character, and we've seen that. Abraham passing off his wife as his sister, and Jacob cheating his brother and cheating his father. So in that, with them in our minds, when he says this, with Joseph, we see a more mature faith. In the most difficult of circumstances, he finds that God is with him, and without stooping to the dubious devices employed by his father and great-grandfather, he reaches an exalted position in Egypt, the superpower of his day. Now, that's a bold statement. To what extent Joseph does, in fact, demonstrate a more mature character and without stooping to dubious devices, I will leave you to judge. And as we go through the story this evening, you might think that at certain times maybe he's not quite at that high level. But I think in general, we do see in Joseph somebody who maybe is of a more mature character. Nevertheless, it's also important, having mentioned if you like, the distinctive qualities of the Joseph story, it's important to notice the links between the Joseph story and the previous chapters. Like the story of Jacob, this is a story that will involve conflict and reconciliation between brothers. Okay, so that's one immediate link with the Jacob story. This is a story that's going to involve conflict and reconciliation between brothers. And like the story of Abraham, it involves what we might call the near death of a beloved son. Now, we saw that with Abraham a couple of weeks ago, that as soon as Isaac was born, God calls on him to sacrifice his son. He doesn't have to, but there's a kind of near death of a beloved son, and we're going to see that same motif this evening. So as we look at the Joseph story this evening, different in some ways, less kind of overt presence of God, but nevertheless strong links, strong connections with what's gone before. And the other thing to say about the story before we really dive into it is that although it doesn't have a nice chiastic structure that we talked about last week, we talked about the chiastic structure of the Jacob story, none of that in Joseph. Nevertheless, the Joseph story is very carefully organized and it's very well balanced. It hasn't just been thrown together. Joseph, for example, has 3 work positions, if we can call them that. We're going to look at that later. He has 3 work positions in different places, and his family make 3 visits to Egypt. So we've got a 3 and 3 balance. And dreams. Dreams are important in the Joseph story, and they come in pairs. So Joseph has 2 dreams right at the start. And later, when he's in prison, we have the butler and the baker, and they each have a dream. And later on, Pharaoh will have 2 dreams. So dreams come in pairs. So you get the idea. This is a really carefully balanced, organised story. And not only that, there are some very, very subtle connections between the stories. And again, we're going to see that tonight, that as we go through this story of Joseph, the different parts are interlinked. There are ways in which they're joined together, and as we read one part we think, oh, that reminds us of something we read earlier, or it anticipates something we're going to read in the future. So it's a really nicely constructed story. Right, let's dive in then to Joseph and chapter 37, if you've got your Bible with you. And when we first meet Joseph, he is 17 years old. And he is, as Walter Moberly describes him, a somewhat priggish teenager. That's a pretty good description of Joseph as a 17-year-old, a somewhat priggish teenager. He's a tattletale, and he's a bit full of himself. In fact, the first thing we read about Joseph, the very first thing we read about him, is that while he was looking after his brother's sheep, he brought a bad report about 2 of his brothers to his father. That's the very first thing we read about Joseph. He brings a bad report about his brothers to his father. So that gives you a little bit of a clue to his character. We also discover that his father Jacob loved him more than any of his other children. That old failing of family favoritism that we've seen so often as we've gone through Genesis rears its ugly head again. Family favoritism. One parent favours this child, another parent favours that child. Well, we've got it again with Jacob favouring Joseph, and it says, chapter 37.3, he loved him more than any of his other children, and he gave him a special kind of robe or special kind of cloak. And probably if there's one thing that Joseph is famous for, it's the coat, isn't it? It's the cloak. Put your hands up if you've ever been to see Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. A few of you. Okay. And of course that is one translation of the text. One translation of the verse is that his father gave him a multicoloured coat. That goes back to the Septuagint, and Martin Luther popularised that translation, but actually the Hebrew here is not very easy to understand. It might mean multicoloured, or it might just mean richly ornamental. It might mean a coat with sleeves. Okay, we're not quite sure exactly how to translate it. The only other time in the Old Testament where this particular Hebrew word is used is in 2 Samuel 13 verse 18. I'm just going to repeat that if you want to jot it down. 2 Samuel 13 verse 18. And there, this robe, this cloak is worn by a princess. So all we can say for sure is that this cloak that Jacob gave his son was really special, and it denoted very high status. Okay, this wasn't something you just give to anybody. It was something you would give as a very special gift to a very special person. And so that's clearly a sign of Jacob's favoritism and affection for Joseph, this wonderful cloak that he gives him. And of course this causes huge resentment and jealousy in his brothers. And the situation gets even worse when Joseph tells them about 2 dreams in which he's seen them all bowing down to him. Well, he doesn't actually say, I saw you bowing down to me, but it's pretty obvious that's what the dream means. I saw you and I saw my mum and dad bowing down to me. Fancy that. At the very best, that is insensitive, and at worst, it's incredibly prideful, isn't it? The best you can say, it's just youthful insensitivity, but it does smack of pride as well. So that's our first glimpse of Joseph. He's young, he's doted on by his father, he's the favourite, and he seems to have this kind of very smug, priggish character that Walter Moberly describes about him. It is interesting, though, that in chapter 7, verse 11, after talking about those dreams, the narrator then just adds a little comment, but Jacob kept the matter in mind. Just a little hint there that actually these dreams may have some significance. These dreams may have something to them. There's just a little hint that the narrator drops in there that Jacob kept these dreams in mind. Anyway, it's no surprise when Joseph's brothers seize their opportunity to take their revenge. And what happens is that on one day, Jacob sends Joseph out to see how they're doing and how the flocks are. And as he comes up to his brothers, they pounce on him and they strip his robe off him. And first of all, they throw him into a pit where they hope he will die. And then a caravan of traders comes past, and the brothers think, well, we might as well make a little bit of money out of it. And so they pull him out of the pit and they sell Joseph to the Midianite traders. And to cover up their actions, they kill a goat, they dip his robe in the blood, and they take it back to Jacob to make it look as if Joseph has been killed by a wild animal. And they show him the cloak, and sure enough, Jacob comes to exactly that conclusion, and he's absolutely overcome with grief when he sees this cloak. My son is dead. My son has been killed. He's utterly heartbroken. And so at the end of this first section, the family are, as one scholar put it, rent from top to bottom by hatred and grief. The family are rent from top to bottom by hatred and grief. Have sold Joseph, and their father believes he's been killed. But instead of telling us what happened next to Joseph, the storyteller breaks off at this point, and in chapter 38 he gives us a strange and not very edifying story about one of Joseph's brothers, a man called Judah. And the story runs like this. Judah marries a Canaanite girl. That immediately rings kind of alarm bells in our minds. Judah marries a Canaanite girl, and their first son, who has the name marries a girl called Tamar. We then read, with absolutely no explanation, that was wicked in the Lord's sight, so the Lord put him to death. No further details given. And so, in keeping with custom at that time, brother, Onan, marries his sister-in-law, Tamar. That was what's called the levirate practice. If you were married and your husband died, it was a responsibility of one of your husband's brothers to marry you to provide security, to provide shelter. And so Onan marries Tamar, but exactly the same thing happens to Onan. He is wicked, and the Lord puts him to death. Now, what should have happened at this point is that Judah should then have given his youngest son, Shelah, to Tamar. But of course, Judah is a little bit frightened at this point, and he thinks, well, 2 of my sons have had their lives ended prematurely. And so Judah drags his feet, And Judah just gives Tamar a room in his house where she can live alone. He's got no intention of allowing her to marry his youngest son. He just kicks that into the long grass and says to Tamar, well, you come and stay with me and you can have a room in my house. Fear of what might happen trumps obedience to God's plan for fruitfulness, and Tamar's wishes are completely ignored. But Tamar is not simply a passive victim. A little while later, Tamar disguises herself as a prostitute. And she goes and sits by the roadside in her prostitute's garb, waiting. This is a painting, by the way, from Marc Chagall, Tamar, beautiful daughter of Judah, and you can see Tamar there kind of veiled, and that's Judah in the background. So that's what Tamar does. She goes and sits by the roadside, waiting for a customer. And presently, her father-in-law comes along, Judah. And because she is veiled, he assumes that she's just a prostitute, and he asks to sleep with her. And Tamar agrees in return for a goat, plus Judah's cord and his staff and his seal as a deposit. And he agrees. Judah is told Tamar is pregnant. Your unmarried daughter-in-law is pregnant. And Judah is absolutely enraged at this scandal that his daughter-in-law, who's not married a member, is pregnant. And so Judah demands that she be publicly brought out and burnt to death. Bring her out, burn her to death. And now, of course, Tamar plays her trump card. When the men come to get her, she sends out a message saying, I am pregnant by the man who owns these. See if you recognize them. And these, are, of course, are Judah's seal and his staff and his cord. Judah is trapped. Judah is trapped. He is the one who got her pregnant. And he has to say, she is more righteous than I. And he can have nothing else to say about it. She's well and truly trumped him. She's well and truly shown him up. Story. I said it was an unedifying story. But to many readers of the Bible and to many scholars, it's not only unedifying, it's also a completely irrelevant story. It's got absolutely nothing to do with what's gone before or what comes after. It's completely irrelevant. But it isn't. Back in 1981, this man, Robert Alter, wrote an absolutely superb book called The Art of Biblical Narrative. And one of the things that Robert Alter does in this book is to look very closely at this story in Genesis 38, and he shows us how, in fact, this story is very closely linked with what goes before and what goes after. Now, you haven't read the book. Can any of you, just from what you've heard tonight, can any of you see any links between this story of Judah and Tamar and the preceding story about Joseph being sold to the Midianite traders? Can any of you think of any connections? What comes up in both stories? The goat. What do Joseph's brothers do when they sell him to the traders? They kill a goat and dip the cloak in the blood. What does Tamar ask as her price? A goat. Right, for a start, you've got the goat in common. Yep. You've also got a little question. Do you recognize this? It's what the brothers say when they go back to their father with that blood-stained cloak rather, and the brothers say to their father, "Look, do you recognize this?" And he recognized it. And when the men come to get Tamar, she sends out that message with the staff and the cord and the seal, and she says exactly the same thing in Hebrew. "Look, do you recognize?" And he recognized it. So that is a very clear link between the two stories. And Robert Alter says this little phrase, "Do you recognize this?" The first use of the formula was for an act of deception, when the brothers showed the cloak covered in blood to their father and they're trying to deceive him. And that's when they say, "Do you recognize this?" The first use of the formula was for an act of deception. The second use is for an act of unmasking. Judah with Tamar, after Judah and his brothers, is an exemplary narrative instance of the deceiver deceived. He is taken in by a piece of attire as his father was. So here's this story that at first sight seems completely out of place, seems to have nothing to do with the previous story, but in actual fact the storyteller has put some very subtle links to connect the two stories. We also, by the way, get a very important glimpse of Judah's character here. He's going to play an important part later. And before we move on to chapter 39, don't miss the detail about the twins that Tamar gives birth to. So we know she's pregnant, and when she gives birth to twins, and the younger one, Perez, is going to be the head of the clan from which Boaz will later come. And from the clan of Boaz comes which Old Testament king? David. Comes our Lord Jesus Christ. Perez, one of the twins born to Tamar. One of the twins born to that woman who lost two husbands, who was shamefully treated by her father-in-law, who disguises herself as a prostitute. But in the sovereignty of God, she gives birth to two twins, and one of those will become an ancestor of our Lord Jesus Christ. That's a wonderful bit of divine sovereignty, isn't it? So that's the if you like, all the kind of introduction to the main bulk of the story of Joseph. We've got him as this spoilt teenager being sold to the Ishmaelites and taken off to Egypt. And then we've got this story about Judah and Tamar. And then chapters 39 to 41, we really dive into the story of Joseph down in Egypt. And in chapters 39 to 41, we've got three balancing episodes. First of all, promotion in the house of an Egyptian officer called Potiphar, and then a prolonged imprisonment, and then finally release and promotion again in the palace of Pharaoh. And so we've got a nice, satisfying, integrated story, and it's got an overall up shape to it, if you like. So up in the house of Potiphar, down into prison, and then back up again in the palace of the Pharaoh. So it all starts really well in Potiphar's house. We read in chapter 39, 3 and 4, when his master saw that the Lord was with him and the Lord gave him success in everything he did, Joseph found favour in his eyes. Potiphar put him in charge of his household and entrusted to his care everything he owned. So all was going really swimmingly, all going really well, until Potiphar's wife takes a fancy to Joseph, because we're told he's really quite a good-looking guy, and she tries to seduce him. And Joseph shows exemplary honour and self-discipline. Chapter 39, verse 9, "How could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God. Your husband has made me master of this house. He's just entrusted me with responsibility. How could I possibly do such a wicked thing to him? But more importantly, how could I sin against God? And so despite her constantly nagging him and trying to get him into bed, he says no. And then finally, one day when nobody else is in the house, Potiphar's wife, we don't know her name, grabs Joseph by his cloak, and he runs out of the house, leaving his cloak behind, and she cooks up a story that he tried to rape her. Potiphar is absolutely furious when he gets home, and he has Joseph thrown into prison. It's all gone wrong. Joseph thought that the Lord was with him, and now he's been thrown into prison. But one thing has not changed. Chapter 39, 20 to 21, we read the same thing. While Joseph was there in the prison, the Lord was with him. Really important that the fact that his circumstances have been turned upside down does not alter the fact that the Lord is with him. The Lord was with him when he was flying high in the house of Potiphar and things were going absolutely hunky-dory and everything was fine. And the Lord was with him when he was thrown unjustly into prison. The narrator wants us to take that to heart. Whatever our circumstances, the Lord is with you. Change of circumstances don't change that. And wanted to give you a comment here on this phrase, the Lord was with Joseph. A little comment from a great German scholar, Gerhard von Rad. And he says that this phrase, the Lord was with him, implies quite real protection and promotion in the matters of his external life. Not, to be sure, protection from distress, but rather in the midst of distress. Okay, that's von Rad's comment on this phrase, the Lord was with him. It doesn't necessarily mean that the Lord protects Joseph from distress, but he protects Joseph in the midst of distress, just as he does for us. One reason why I've given you this comment from Gerhard von Rad is that Gerhard von Rad was himself a prisoner. He was a German scholar in the 1930s, and then he was called up, and he ended up 1944, 1945 as a prisoner of war in Germany, in a prisoner of war camp. And there's a wonderful story to be written about this, because while he was there in the camp, he did Bible studies on the book of Genesis with his fellow prisoners of war. There's a wonderful story to be written about. But I just wanted to highlight the point that when von Rad says that the Lord being with us does not mean protection from distress, but in distress, he knows whereof he speaks. This is one prisoner talking about another prisoner. This is a scholar who knows what it means to be imprisoned. Who better to comment on Joseph's situation here? So there he is. He's thrown into prison. But in prison, Joseph gains the respect and the favour of the prison warder, and the prison warder puts him in charge of the prison. And now, of course, we realise that the story of Judah and Tamar that we read in the previous chapter is actually linked not only with what went before, but with what came after. Here's Robert Alter again, talking about the contrast between those two stories, Genesis 38 and Genesis 39. When we return from Judah to the Joseph story, we move in pointed contrast from a tale of exposure through sexual incontinence to a tale of seeming defeat and ultimate triumph through sexual continence. So chapter 38, you've got Judah's indiscipline, you've got his sexual appetite, sleeping with this prostitute by the road, and he's completely exposed as a result of that. What a contrast when you come to chapter 39 and Joseph in the house of Potiphar, resisting the advances of Potiphar's wife and actually coming out on top. So again, you can see how that story about Judah and Tamar, although it seems to have nothing to do with what's around it, actually throws light on the story around it and is very closely connected. So there's Joseph in prison. And the prison warder entrusts him with responsibilities, and better yet is to follow, because a little bit later, two of Joseph's fellow prisoners, Pharaoh's former cupbearer and his chief baker, they've been thrown into prison as well, and they are troubled by dreams that they cannot understand. In the ancient Near East, dream interpretation was a complex and dark art. Okay? For Joseph, it was a charisma, a divine gift. Big difference in attitudes to dream interpretation. For the Egyptians, for the Babylonians, for the Assyrians, the way to interpret dreams was to study lots and lots of dark, ugly stuff. For the people of Israel, interpretation of dreams is a divine gift. And so when Joseph hears the cupbearer and the baker talking about these dreams that they've had and they don't understand, he says, tell me your dreams. Do not interpretations belong to God? And they tell him their dreams, and Joseph interprets them. The cupbearer will be restored to his position, while unfortunately the baker is going to be hanged. Joseph, though, is a human being, and he's got his own hurts and he's got his own sorrows. And as he talks to the cupbearer and says, now listen, in 3 days' time you're going to be released and restored to your position, Joseph says to him, please, when you're back in the palace, please mention me to Pharaoh and get me out of this prison. For I was forcibly carried off from the land of the Hebrews, and even here I've done nothing to deserve being put in this dungeon. I just love the way at this point in which, having been shown Joseph as the great administrator, the gifted guy, the one that can interpret dreams, the one that seems completely in control, it's as then his heart just bubbles up and his grief wells up, and he says to the cupbearer, please put a word in for me and get me out of this place. Please get me out of this mess. You really catch a little glimpse of the turmoil and the sorrow going on in Joseph's own heart here. Well, 3 days later, the cupbearer is released. And Joseph must have been so full of hope at that point. I've interpreted his dream. I've told him to put a word in for me, and now he's been summoned from prison, and he's going to go back to the palace, and he's going to have an opportunity to speak to the Pharaoh for me, and I can just, start counting the days. I'm going to be released soon. I'm going to be released soon. They're going to come and call for me. And what happens? The cupbearer forgets all about him. The cupbearer forgets all about him, and Joseph stays in prison for 2 more long years. Can you imagine what a crushing blow that must have been to him? He must have thought that his release was just around the corner. He must have thought, that God had engineered this so that he could get out of prison. He must have been so full of hope. And the cupbearer forgets all about him. And it's 2 long years that he now spends in prison. But don't forget what the narrator has told us. The Lord was with him even then. 2 years later, it's Pharaoh's turn to be troubled by dreams. And you probably know the story here. There's an artist's attempt to capture Pharaoh's dreams. There he is sitting by the River Nile. And in his first dream, the Pharaoh sees 7 plump, healthy cows emerging from the River Nile, followed by 7 scrawny cows. I had a kind of human illustration of this many years ago when I was a student. And I went down to Tyndale House in Cambridge. Tyndale House is a kind of study centre. And I went down to Tyndale House. And on my first morning there, I went in for breakfast. And all these Canadian and North American postgraduate students came walking into the room in their suits and jackets and ties, and you could tell they were Americans. And then a few minutes later, all the British students came in their t-shirts and jeans, and you could tell they were British students. And honestly, it was like the 7 fat cows and the 7 thin cows coming in. But that's the first dream that Pharaoh had. The 7 fat cows coming up out of the River Nile, and then the 7 scrawny cows, and the 7 scrawny cows mysteriously eat up all the fat ones. And then in the second dream, Pharaoh sees 7 healthy ears of corn swallowed up by 7 thin ears of corn. And none of the Pharaoh's wise men can interpret the dreams, and at that moment, the cupbearer remembers Joseph. Oh, how could I possibly have forgotten? I'm sorry, Pharaoh. I meant to tell you, 2 years ago when I was in prison, there was a guy called Joseph and he interpreted my dream. Sorry, I've forgotten for the last 2 years. Get him out. Bring him into the palace, says the Pharaoh. And so we're told that he shaves and changes his clothes, which is a good thing to do if you've been in prison for 2 years. And Joseph comes and he stands before Pharaoh, who tells Joseph his dreams about the 7 fat cows and the 7 fat ears of corn. And to our total amazement, Joseph is able to explain what those dreams mean. Egypt is about to experience 7 years of abundance, followed by 7 years of famine. And it will be a famine so severe that all the abundance of the previous 7 years will be forgotten. Is not only charismatic wisdom, it's pragmatic wisdom. It's a good combination to have. The charismatic wisdom to interpret the dream, but also the pragmatic wisdom to come up with a policy, to come up with a strategy. And that's exactly what Joseph does at this point. And he advises Pharaoh what to do. And he says, what you need to do over the next 7 years, when we've got all this abundance, all this plenty, set aside every year 1/5 of the harvest. Set it aside, put it in store, so that when famine comes, there's going to be plenty of food stored up. And Pharaoh is absolutely bowled over at Joseph's wisdom, and Joseph is appointed as Pharaoh's second in command, with a free hand to oversee the work that he's recommended. So we see what's happened to Joseph. He's had that initial up in the house of Potiphar, where he was promoted to high position. And then we had the false accusation from Potiphar's wife, and he's thrown into prison. And he spends 2 years, or more than 2 years, languishing in prison. And then eventually he's released, and he's promoted again to this really, really high place in Pharaoh's palace. And of course, one of the lessons that comes out of this is, as that old hymn puts it, in all the changing scenes of life, in trouble and in joy, the praises of my God and King shall my heart and tongue employ. Whether things are going swimmingly or whether they're not, doesn't alter the fact the Lord is with his people. And so during the 7 plentiful years that follow, Joseph marries an Egyptian girl, Asenath, who gives birth to 2 sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. What's the significance of those names, I hear you ask? Well, Ephraim is related to a Hebrew word, farah, which means to be fruitful. Where have we heard that word before? Genesis 1, God's original mandate to the first human beings, be fruitful. And Joseph names one of his sons, Ephraim, fruitful. And the other son, he names Manasseh. And Manasseh means something like making you forget. Making you forget, which seems a strange name to give. But Joseph explains it like this. He says, it is because God has made me forget all my trouble and all my father's household. God has made me forget all my trouble and all my father's household. As a commendable attitude by Joseph? I mean, you can understand him wanting to forget all the trouble. But forgetting his father? Forgetting his family? And just looking at the commentators on this verse, a little bit of a kind of difference of opinion, and some commentators saying this is perfectly understandable and after all the hurt he's had, and one or two commentators saying this is actually not a very admirable attitude by Joseph at this point. Well, you can kick that one around, think about that as you want, but that's what Joseph names his children, Ephraim and Manasseh. They're going to come back at the end of the story. But either way, when we get to the end of chapter 41, Joseph is clearly well integrated into Egyptian society, very high position, Egyptian wife. He is very, very well placed to work for the blessing, not only of Egypt, but of the surrounding nations too. He's in exactly the right position to benefit the land of Egypt and the lands all around. So that's Genesis chapters 39 to 41. It's very much all about Joseph in Egypt. Okay, that's really been the focus. His family have kind of faded away into the background, and we've had this story of Joseph in Egypt, house of Potiphar, in prison, back into the palace of Pharaoh, and then starting to take responsibility for organising the storage of the food over the next 7 years. So there's going to be plenty to come when famine strikes. Chapters 42 to 47, now we go back to Joseph's family back in Canaan. And back in Canaan, when the famine strikes in Egypt, the famine also strikes Canaan. It's absolutely across the whole of the then known world. And so people in Canaan are facing starvation. And when Jacob hears that there is grain down in Egypt, he says to his sons, right, go down and get some. It says in Hebrew, why are you standing here looking at each other? Do something, guys. Go down to Egypt and see if you can buy some food. And so Jacob sends all his sons, except his darling Benjamin, down to Egypt to buy some food. And Jacob's sons, all 10 of them, arrive in Egypt, and they come into the palace and they bow down before their governor, who is, of course, their brother Joseph, except they don't recognize him. The dream is starting to be fulfilled. What was Joseph's dream back in chapter 37? I had a dream that all my brothers were bowing down to me. Well, what do you know? In they come, trooping in, thin, tired, discouraged, and they come trooping in. They haven't a clue who he is, and they bow down before him. And then we get another absolutely delicious bit of irony here. As soon as Joseph saw his brothers, he recognized them, but he pretended to be a stranger and spoke harshly to them. Although Joseph recognized his brothers, they did not recognize him. Where have we seen that word before? Do you recognize this? And he recognized it. We had it back in the story of the brothers when they dip his cloak in the blood and they take it to the father, and he recognized it. We had it in the story of Judah and Tamar. He recognized it. And we've got the same idea, exactly the same Hebrew word here. Recognizing, not recognizing. Joseph recognized his brothers, they did not recognize him. And Joseph then proceeds to grill his brothers, and he learns from them that his father and his brother Benjamin are still alive. And at this point, his brothers, who are still unaware of who he is, begin to acknowledge to each other the wrong they've done to Joseph. Joseph speaks really harshly to them, and in fact he puts them in custody for a few days. And now for the first time, Joseph's brothers begin to realize that maybe they are suffering for the wrong that they did to their brother many, many years earlier. Chapter 42, verse 21, they said to one another, surely we are being punished because of our brother. We saw how distressed he was when he pleaded for us for his life, but we would not listen. That's why this distress has come upon us. And Reuben replied, didn't I tell you not to sin against the boy? But you wouldn't listen. Now we must give an accounting for his blood. So you can see now that the brothers are starting to realize the wrong that they did to their brother Joseph. And there's starting to be an element of realism and confession. And at the same time, Joseph's tone and heart also soften after a few days. Joseph says to them, okay, you can go home, and I'm going to send you home with grain, but I'm going to keep Simeon with me. I'm not going to let you all go back. I'm going to keep Simeon here in Egypt. And if you want to have your brother Simeon back, then you've got to come back with Benjamin. Because remember, Jacob has kept Benjamin at home. And Joseph wants to be reunited with his brother Benjamin. He wants to be reunited with all of them. And so he says to the brothers, okay, you can go, but you're going to have to come back with Benjamin. And to make sure you come back with Benjamin, I'm going to keep Simeon here. A bit of power play here from Joseph. Naturally, when the brothers get home and they tell their father what has happened, Jacob is absolutely beside himself with grief. And at first he absolutely refuses to let them make a second trip. He says, I've lost Joseph, because he thinks Joseph is dead. And he says, I've now lost Simeon, because he's been kept in Egypt. No way am I going to let you go and take my darling Benjamin with you. But the famine goes on, and eventually Jacob says, okay, back you go again. Go back to Egypt. Go back to the Pharaoh in Egypt. Go back to that governor. Take Benjamin with you this time, because we've got to have food. And so back the brothers come on a second visit to Egypt. And in they come again to the presence of Joseph. And still, Joseph conceals his identity. When he sees Benjamin with the brothers, he can hardly contain himself, and he has to leave the room in tears for a few minutes. And then he sits down to feast with his brothers. And then, just before sending them back, with food, with Simeon, all of them together, Joseph plays a little trick. A nasty little trick. You might know the story. Just before he sends them on his way with all their sacks of grain, Joseph says to one of his officials, silver cup, put it in the sack belonging to Benjamin. Stick it in the grain in Benjamin's sack. And then off go the brothers, completely unaware of what they've done. Off go the brothers. You just see Joseph waving them goodbye. And they haven't gone very far before Joseph says to his officials, okay guys, go after them. And the officials go running after Joseph's brothers, and they catch up with him, and they say, open your bags. And so they all open their bags. And what do they find in Benjamin's bag? The silver cup. What do you mean by stealing my master's silver cup, they say. What on earth are you doing? Stealing, going off with my master's silver cup. And of course they really are in hot water now, aren't they? Because how can they possibly prove that they didn't steal it? How can they possibly prove they are innocent? And they are all hauled back in to Joseph. And Joseph demands that the one who stole the cup, Benjamin, must remain with him. And then, brothers, the rest of you, you can go home. You can go back to Canaan. And if you want your brother Benjamin back, you're going to have to come back with your father. You see the game that Joseph is playing here. He's not content with 10 of his brothers. He wants all of his brothers, and he wants his father with him in Egypt. And so this is the second little trick he plays. He kind of catches them out with putting the silver cup in Benjamin's sack and making it look as if Benjamin tried to steal it. And so he says to the brothers, okay, Benjamin's a thief. Benjamin's going to stay here with me in prison. You lot can go. Back you go. Off you go. If you want your brother, you come back with your father. And at this point, we get what many scholars regard as one of the finest and most moving and most persuasive speeches to be found anywhere in the Old Testament. And it comes from none other than Judah. So, you leave Benjamin with me. And Judah jumps in. And Judah went up to Pharaoh and said, "Please, my lord, let your servant speak a word to my lord. Do not be angry with your servant, though you are equal to Pharaoh himself." And he carries on, and he says, "Your father, my servant, said to us, 'You know that my wife bore me 2 sons. One of them went away, and I said, he has surely been torn to pieces, and I have not seen him since. If you take this one from me too, and harm comes to him, you will bring my grey head down to the grave in misery.' So now," says Judah, "if the boy Benjamin is not with us when I go back to your servant my father, and if my father, whose life is closely bound up with the boy's life, sees that the boy isn't here, he will die. Your servants will bring the grey head of our father down to the grave in sorrow. Your servant guaranteed the boy's safety to my father. I said, if I do not bring him back to you, I will bear all the blame before you, my father, all my life. Now please then, let your servant remain here as my lord's slave in place of the boy, and let the boy return with his brothers. How can I go back to my father if the boy is not with me? No, do not let me see the misery that will come upon my father." You see what Judah says here? He says, no way. Can I go back and tell my father? He will die of grief. Please, sir, take me instead. I'll stay here. I'll stay in prison. Please let Benjamin go back. Please let Benjamin go back to my father. At this point, Joseph absolutely cracks. Then Joseph could no longer control himself before all his attendants, and he cried out, "Make everybody leave my presence." So there was no one with Joseph when he made himself known to his brothers. And he wept so loud that the Egyptians heard him, and Pharaoh's household heard about it. And Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still living?" But his brothers were not able to answer him because they were terrified at his presence. And of course his brothers are absolutely terrified because they know what they did, and now they know that he knows. What's he going to do to them for what they did to him? But now Joseph voices the great theological truth to which his whole story has been building up. Chapter 45, verses 5 and 8, and Joseph says to his brothers, "Do not be distressed. God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So then, it was not you who sent me here, but God." It's the theological truth that the whole story has been moving towards. Yes, of course, at the human level, his brothers bear responsibility. Yes, of course, it was their actions that sold Joseph into slavery. Yes, of course, it was their evil that did that. And yet, Joseph is able to say to his brothers, whatever you were thinking was one thing, but God was thinking something else. You did this to harm me, he will say later. You meant to do this for evil, but God meant it for good. God it was who sent me here. God went ahead of me and brought me here, and he did this to bring about this great deliverance. Notice, by the way, how solid God-centered theology is the best foundation for warm pastoral reassurance. Do not be distressed. There's the voice of the pastor. it was not you who sent me here, but God, there's the voice of the theologian. Theology is the basis for good pastoral care. And so Joseph makes his identity known to his brothers, and we get this wonderful emotional reunion and reconciliation. In chapter 45, verse 14, then he threw his arms around his brother Benjamin and wept, and Benjamin embraced him weeping, and then he kissed all his brothers and wept over them, and afterwards his brothers talked with him. Wonderful emotional reunion and reconciliation after those years of hatred. Remember what we said at the start of the story, a family rent by hatred and grief. And years have gone past with that hatred and grief, and doubtless a growing sense of guilt building up. And it all comes out here with this wonderful reunion and reconciliation between Joseph and his brothers. And so the brothers return to Canaan with the joyful news that Joseph is still alive. And Jacob, of course, back in Canaan, Jacob is absolutely speechless, and at first he doesn't believe them. But when he sees the carts that Joseph has sent for transport to bring him down to Egypt, Jacob finally allows himself to believe. And so, chapter 46, Jacob sets out on one last journey. And it's at this point that God makes this final appearance to him. Chapter 46, verses 2 and 3 and 4. And God spoke to Israel in a vision at night, and he said, Jacob, Jacob, here I am, he replied. I am God, the God of your father, he said. Do not be afraid to go down to Egypt, for I will make you into a great nation there. I will go down to Egypt with you, and I will surely bring you back again. And then in the rest of chapter 46, we get the full listing of Jacob's wives and sons and grandsons that made this long trek down to Egypt. And there are a total of 70. It's not exactly the sand of the seashore, it's not quite that number, but it's not a bad start. And 70, of course, is a hugely significant number. God's promise of children is starting to be fulfilled. Remember, we go back to Abraham. There was the promise there. I will make you fruitful. I will give you descendants like the sand of the seashore. And by the end of the Abraham story, we got one. We got one boy. We got Isaac. Now we get to the end of the Joseph story. We got 70. We got a growing family. And as Jacob arrives in Goshen, Joseph goes out to meet him, and against all the odds, not only are brothers reconciled, but father and son are finally reunited. Chapter 46, verses 29 to 30. Joseph had his chariot made ready and went to Goshen to meet his father Israel. And as soon as Joseph appeared before him, he threw his arms around his father and wept for a long time. And Israel said to Joseph, now I am ready to die, since I have seen for myself that you are still alive. I think this is the Old Testament equivalent of what we sometimes call the Nunc Dimittis in the Gospel of Luke. Remember that story when they bring the infant Jesus into the temple shortly after he's born, and Simeon is there in the temple. And Luke tells us that when Simeon sees Jesus, he says to God, Lord, you can let me die now. I'm ready to die. My eyes have seen your salvation. Something a little bit like that here. Jacob saying, now I'm ready to die. I've seen my son again. Well, after all that high emotion and suspense, Genesis 47 actually probably feels a bit like an anticlimax. But hugs and tears do not feed people. And so what we see in Genesis 47 is Joseph providing, first of all, for his family by arranging for them to settle in the region of Goshen, and then providing for the rest of Egypt as the famine continues to bite. If you've read chapter 47 before coming down here, or maybe some other time, you might have thought that Joseph's actions in chapter 47 look rather exploitative and manipulative, because what Joseph says to the Egyptians is, right, I'll give you food, but you need to let me have your land and your property. But you do have to remember that in the Old Testament, buying the land of your destitute relatives and allowing them to work it was how you showed faithfulness. That's how you showed generosity. If your relatives fell on hard times and they didn't have any food, you didn't just bail them out. The practice was that they would give you the land. You would in effect become the owner temporarily, and your relatives would be allowed to work it. And so when the Egyptians say to Joseph, you have saved our lives, there is no reason to believe that they didn't mean it. So we've got another promise that God made to Abraham starting to be fulfilled. Remember those promises? One was the promise of blessing, one was the promise of descendants, but one of those promises to Abraham, in you all the nations of the earth will be blessed. And that is just starting to come to fruition, only very partially, not completely by any means, but starting to be fulfilled as Egypt and the lands around begin to benefit from Joseph's wise policies over the preceding 14 years. And in a sense, he is the salvation of those nations. Just a little kind of indication or a little sign of blessing coming to the nations through the family of Abraham. And so that almost brings us to the end of the story of Joseph, into chapters 48 to 50. Genesis began with blessing and it ends with blessing. 3 chapters of it. As Jacob is dying, he recalls that first encounter he had with God way back at Bethel, and he testifies to how God has fulfilled his promise of blessing him. And then Jacob calls Joseph to bring in his 2 sons who were born in Egypt. Remember them? Manasseh and Ephraim. They're the 2 sons that were born in Egypt, so that he can bless them as well. And so Joseph brings in these 2 boys. And as Joseph brings them in, Jacob places his right hand on the younger one, Ephraim. Not this time because he's being deceived. Not this time because he's blind. He knows exactly what he's doing. The younger will be the greater, he says. And finally, chapter 49, Jacob speaks his blessings upon all his sons. Now, some of the blessings and the words of the blessings in chapter 49 are cryptic and puzzling, but there is one blessing that stands out. There is one son who stands out in chapter 49. It's the blessing on Judah. It's the longest of all the blessings, and it's the most glowing of all the blessings. Chapter 49, verses 8 to 12. Judah, your brothers will praise you. Your hand will be on the neck of your enemies. Your father's sons will bow down to you. You are a lion's cub, O Judah. You returned from the prey, my son. Verse 10, the scepter will not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until he comes to whom it belongs, and the obedience of the nations is his. Judah, the brother who had taken the lead in selling Joseph as a slave. It was his idea. It was Judah's idea to sell him. The one who had taken the lead in selling Joseph as a slave. The one who had ignored and then slept with his own daughter-in-law, thinking she was a prostitute. But also the one who had come to acknowledge his failures. And remember that moment when he stood in for his brother Benjamin and said, no, I'll stay here. Let Benjamin go back. The one who made that amazing speech of acknowledging his failures. Judah is given the position of leadership and the promise of kingship. That is the blessing that really stands out here. the blessing of Judah. It's a kind of theme that runs through Genesis, and sometimes it's easy to ignore. But you remember one of the things that God said to Abraham? Kings will come from you. And it's one of the slightly less emphasized themes in Genesis, but it comes out here at the end. The blessing on Judah. The scepter will not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet. And of course we can trace that blessing, we can trace that line right the way through the Old Testament and right the way into the New Testament. What is Jesus called in the book of Revelation? The Lion of Judah. That theme runs all the way through. Closing. I mentioned a form of Bible interpretation known as typology. Do you remember that from the first night? If you were here the first night, somebody brought up the question of typology, and we had a very quick discussion about typology. Remember that? And the idea with typology is that there are people or events in the Old Testament that have a counterpart in the New Testament. That's basically the idea of typology. So you've got the person in the Old Testament is the type, and then the counterpart in the New Testament is the antitype. And the antitype is always greater than the type. The original is good and significant and important, but the antitype is always greater. So sometimes Jesus is seen as David, type, antitype. Or sometimes baptism is seen as the crossing through the Red Sea is seen as a picture of baptism, type, antitype. You get the idea. Events in the Old Testament, people in the New Testament have a counterpart in the New Testament. This is what we sometimes call typology. And in some Christian circles, in the 19th century, early 20th century, that was really popular. That was a really popular way of reading the Bible, looking for types and antitypes. And then, like these things do, it kind of fell out of fashion for a while, and then it's kind of come back into fashion recently. In some circles, it never went out of fashion. But typology, there's a scholar called Gary Anderson, Roman Catholic scholar over at University of Notre Dame in the States. And Gary Anderson argues that we can see this in those stories of the Old Testament, which include the election of a younger son, his near-death experience, and his subsequent resurrection. And there are a number of stories in the Old Testament that have that pattern. A chosen younger son who has a near-death experience and then a kind of subsequent resurrection. And Gary Anderson points out that you see that pattern very, very clearly in the Joseph story. Joseph is favoured by his father over his brothers. He's the beloved son. His brothers hate him, throw him into a pit to die, and then sell him into slavery, the near-death experience. His father Jacob really assumes that he is dead, but then eventually Joseph's sufferings bring life to the world and the transformations of his brothers. And Gary Anderson says, you've got here a kind of prefiguring of what we will have in the story of Jesus. And Gary Anderson finds this picture, it's not very clear, you can look at it more clearly later, I've got it in this book here, but this is a 13th century page from the Biblia Pauperum, Bible of the Poor, and it shows you three stories. What if I can get... Now in the middle, over here on the left, can you see somebody being thrown into a well? Looks like a chimney, but it's a well. That's Joseph. That's meant to be Joseph's brothers throwing him into a well. Okay? So on the left we've got the Old Testament story of Joseph being thrown into the well. If you come over to the right, anyone guess what that story is?
It's a storm.
Well, it's a storm. It's another Old Testament story.
Looks like they're on a boat.
They are on a boat.
Noah?
Jonah. And he's about to be thrown overboard, and there's the big fish waiting to swallow him. So we've got two Old Testament stories showing somebody being thrown to their death. Okay? So Joseph thrown to his death, although he doesn't die, but thrown into the pit. But of course he will have a kind of resurrection later. Jonah thrown over the boat into the sea, but he will have a kind of resurrection when the big fish spews him up on the land. And right in the middle, you see Jesus. After he's taken down from the cross and being lowered into the grave before his resurrection. You can see what the artist is trying to suggest there. That you've got these two Old Testament stories prefiguring, not in a perfect way, that's not the idea with typology, but kind of prefiguring what will happen with Jesus. The firstborn son, in the case, or the favoured son in the case of Joseph, a near-death experience, and then a resurrection, and then blessing for others. In the case of Joseph, of course, it's blessing for Egypt and the world. In the case of Jonah, it's blessing for Nineveh. In the case of Jesus, it's blessing for all of us. That's the idea with typology. And Gary Anderson just ends with this comment, which I thought you might like. He says, and this is the key to the Passion. Like the brothers of Joseph, we reject the elect one of Israel, Jesus. But the elect one does not reject us. And strikingly, it is precisely the culpability, the guilt of the brothers or the disciples that allows them to experience and ponder the miracle of their forgiveness. That's the idea that Gary Anderson is suggesting, that when you come to the end of Genesis and you see Joseph standing before his brothers, or his brothers standing before Joseph, there they are, standing guilty before the brother they tried to kill. There they are, defenseless, nothing they can say in their defense. And there's their brother in a position of power, a position of authority, back from the dead. They thought they killed him. They haven't. He's alive. And they're standing before him. And what's Joseph going to say to them? And he speaks words of reconciliation and forgiveness. Do not be afraid. And Gary Anderson says that's exactly how it is for us when we come and stand before the one that we rejected, the Son of God, and we thought was dead, but he is alive forever and ever. And he comes and he speaks to us words of reassurance and grace and forgiveness. Nice example of typology. If you want to, if you're really keen, and you asked me very nicely, I will let you borrow my book, which has got that essay in it, and it's also got that picture in it. If you want to have a close look later, it's in here somewhere. Where are we? And then we see that in the rest of the book of Genesis, how God calls Abraham to be the means of a new start, the means of blessing to the world. And with his sons, we see people who often get it so wrong, and yet increasingly seem to grow in their faith, grow in their understanding of God. And when we get to the end of Genesis, we've got the beginnings of God's promise starting to be fulfilled. Promise of descendants, promise of relationship, promise of being a blessing to the nations. That's where we get to at the end of Genesis. It is not, by any means, the end of the story. God's promise certainly has not been fully worked out. That's going to take a long time, but we're on the way towards it being fulfilled. I'm going to finish there and throw it over to you. Any questions, any comments? Chrissy.
Is the Manasseh mentioned in Joseph the same wicked king Manasseh?
Yep. Well, it wasn't the same person, but it was Manasseh, King Manasseh. I think what you're asking is, was he from the tribe of Manasseh? And I'm not actually sure, Chrissy. Don't know. Good question. Don't know. I mean, horrible. I mean, the associations with King Manasseh are horrible, but I don't actually know if he's in the same tribe. Good question. I think we're going to finish by 9 o'clock this evening, which is the first time we've done that in 4 weeks. So well done. Thank you very much, everyone. Do stay and chat if you want to. Don't forget the sign-up sheet if you want to have the notes. And look forward maybe to seeing you back in September when we look at the Book of Psalms. Thank you very much.
Thank you.